turbo engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
discoveries,
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to this week's Naked Scientists, the programme that brings you the latest in science, technology and medicine. I'm Chris Smith, and in the show this week, your questions are going under our microscope, including why the Neanderthal in us may alter our susceptibility to COVID-19, how black holes work, and why do we run temperatures when we get ill. Plus, there's going to be our customary quiz at half-time when we'll test the mettle of our team. With me are an astronomer, an archaeologist, a global health specialist and a physicist.
The Naked Scientists podcast is powered by ukfast.co.uk.
And on this World Cup kicking off week, we will kick off with a look at our lineup. Emma Pomeroy is an archaeologist at the University of Cambridge. She has worked on our close relatives, those are the Neanderthals, and she's also interested in how susceptibilities to different diseases that we see today evolved in the past. Hello, Emma. Welcome to the programme. It's been a huge year, I want to say, for people interested in Neanderthals, hasn't it? Especially in the last few months, because we've seen a Nobel Prize for the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. We also saw that amazing paper where, again, genomics had been brought to bear against people living in caves, two adjacent caves in Russia, those Neanderthal communities where they showed there was society there. Also, we've seen not Neanderthals, but the first amputation of a person from about 30,000 years ago who survived. So it's been sort of big year for your field.
Absolutely, and I think it always is. There are so many discoveries and new techniques. You know, you might think of Neanderthals and fossils, and there's not much happening in that field. But actually, we're discovering new species, new things that we could never have imagined studying. Like you said, the relationships between individuals found in particular caves. So really exciting stuff.
And this question about our susceptibility to modern diseases, that being rooted in our evolutionary past. I know we're going to talk about that a bit more in the programme. So anyway, good to have you back with us, Emma
good
Pomeroy.
To be back, thank you.
Jonathan Kennedy's also here. Jonathan actually works for the Global Health Team at Queen Mary University of London. He's got a book coming out next year. It's going to be called Pathogenesis. It's absolutely brilliant, actually, Jonathan. I've really enjoyed reading this book. It's a beautiful exploration of, again, some of what Emma's saying about our evolutionary origins and how diseases play out in the past and really take shape in the modern era as well. In your book, do you actually see how our past leads us to really the risk of diseases and the way that they manifest in the modern era?
Well, I think the whole kind of narrative of the book is arguing that viruses, bacteria and other pathogens have just had a fundamental role in not just the evolution of complex life and humans, but social, political, and also economic life. So the meta-argument, I suppose, is that we can't understand the world that we live in without looking at these pandemics that have affected humanity for over the last few thousand years.
In your book, you talk about going back a couple of thousand years just to say Athens and the plague of Athens, and you can now begin to piece back together what that probably was. We think that was a flu pandemic.
Possibly, but this has been one of the tough ones to decipher. There was, about 10 years ago, a study that thought it was typhoid, but there were various problems identified with that paper, so it ended up not being accepted. But still, the best evidence we have is the description by Thucydides of the disease, and scientists have gone by that, really.
So we think that COVID was a big problem for us in the modern era. Our ancestors were also grappling with pandemics even thousands of years ago. So that's Jonathan Kennedy. Also here is Rosemary Williams. Now, Rosemary is a budding astronomer and astrophysicist. She's been an intern with NASA, not once, not twice, but actually 3 times, and she's also worked with the Griffith Observatory in California. She's now over here, or rather just north of the border in Scotland at the University of Edinburgh, where she's studying for a Master's in Science Communication. So you've slewed sideways from pure science into how to get science across to the general public. Why the transition?
I think I realized that I loved talking about scientists more than I loved actually being in the lab and studying it. And so I realized I should probably transition out of that unless I wanted to be writing grant proposals for the rest of my life.
It's a big year for people interested in space science as well, isn't it? Because we're embarking on trips and forays back to the moon, where we haven't been for nearly half a century.
Oh, yeah, that was so exciting the other day, actually.
And of course, then the mission to clobber an asteroid to see if we could divert it. So yes, I mean, space continues to appeal to people very much, doesn't it? I mean, it's always grabs attention straight away.
It does, yeah.
I mean, when we put the call out for this programme saying there's going to be a space scientist along, send in your questions. I don't want to wow you out or anything, but 4/5 of the questions straight away.
Boy.
Astrophysics,
I'm
black
excited.
holes. Anyway, that's Rosemary. Also with us, Andrew Morris. Now, Andrew's a physicist by training and background who then became a teacher. And now he still teaches, but in a slightly different way, because he's written a book. It's called Bugs, Drugs and 3-Pin Plugs. I've got a copy of that in front of me. I really enjoyed reading this as well, Andrew. And the reason I enjoyed it is because what you've tried to do is basically put into plain, simple language a lot of the questions that grown-ups probably get asked by kids and currently say, ask your teacher.
Exactly. Well, I used to be a regular teacher in the sixth form college and a further education college teaching physics and maths. But I always felt, going back to my own teenage, that I was just interested in asking questions about the world around me. And I've always felt sure that most people are like that. They are curious, even though they might find science at school difficult. So I set up this experimental idea of trying to run in groups, teaching in an adult education centre in London, in which I took the risk of just inviting the people to ask questions. They might be outside my field or they might not. And to see if a discussion could evolve, and without necessarily having the answer to their precise question, I could use this as an entry point into some of the basic ideas about science, molecules, cells, and so on.
But equally, I think I always make the case when we're doing shows like this, if people ask us a question and we don't know the answer, because at the end of the day, the reason scientists are employed as scientists is because we don't have all the answers.
Yeah, exactly.
Often the answer, I don't know, is as valuable because you can then use it to explain to people how we might go about working it out. Or, I mean, we did this show up in Edinburgh where Rosemary hangs out, and you might have a perspective on this, Rosemary. Someone in the audience when we did this Q&A show said, how many protons are there in a star? And I don't know if they thought they were being funny. But then actually, I mean, the person they put it to was initially a bit scared. And then I said, well, we could work this out, actually.
I mean, I think that's a very detailed example, but I think that approach of modelling, trying to actually not exactly answer precisely a question, but to think of the process by which you would get at an answer,
very valuable.
Estimating is a particularly important scientific literacy.
Or guesstimation, as we like to call it. Anyway, that is Andrew Morris, the author of Bugs, Drugs and 3-Pin Plugs. Enjoyable book. Thank you very much. He's here to answer your physics questions. So that is our team. Well, let's begin rummaging through the mailbag to find out the answers to the questions you've already been sending in. And Rosemary, I mentioned you've been very popular in our call for questions, so you're up first. And this one's from Emma, not the Emma sitting next to you, but another Emma, who says, is there a definitive point above the Earth where our atmosphere ends and outer space begins?
Yeah, that's a great question. The issue with astronomy and all things in general is there's very rarely like a black and white answer. You know, the atmosphere, it doesn't have an edge, so to speak. It kind of fades out. So scientists have categorized the atmosphere into a few different layers. The one that's most valuable to all of us, I guess the one that we're going to be interacting with our whole lives, is called the troposphere. And that's where 75% of all of the atmospheric particles lay. And it goes all the way out to the exosphere, which actually reaches about halfway to the moon. So it's this very, very large range for the atmosphere. But, you know, most people think that space probably starts a little bit before halfway to the moon, you know. So in the 1900s, there was a scientist named Theodor von Karman. And he basically calculated the highest point that an aircraft could function within the atmosphere, right? So planes rely on air to provide lift. And so he calculated about 84 kilometers around there was the highest point that a plane could fly relying on lift. Now, he ultimately decided that 100 kilometers is just a nicer number. Yeah. There wasn't a lot of science behind that. But 100 kilometers also happens to be about where a satellite can no longer stay in stable orbit, because then you have to take into account the atmosphere interfering with that orbit. So it might destabilize. So, you know, the general consensus is around 100 kilometers. It's not super important. You know, space is space. The only reason that it was kind of concern is politics, you know, who's controlling what aspects of the air and all that. So great question. Thanks, Emma.
So 100 kilometres is our currently accepted.
Yes.
But it's a bit of an arbitrary number because the atmosphere doesn't stop there.
No. No.
other aspects don't stop there.
No.
And the International Space Station, that's at about 400 kilometres, isn't it, up? So it's about 4 times further than that. But that's still in the atmosphere, because I was talking to a space scientist and they were saying they have to periodically give it a boost because it is experiencing drag from the wisps and tendrils of atmosphere that progress and progress even up there.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
There you go. Now you know about the Kármán line. Thank you for that, Rosemary. Emma, one for you. If I happen to come across a skeleton, what are the giveaways that would show its sex or its age? Now, I don't think he means the age of how long it's been in the ground. I think he means as in the bones when that person died. How old were they when they died?
Right, and that's a great question as well. And assessing sort of sex and age at death are two of the fundamental things we do as bone specialists. I should perhaps start out by saying that if you did find a skeleton, you should leave it where it is and not touch it and let the police know just in case it's of forensic relevance. But let's assume you're volunteering on an archaeological dig and you come across some skeletal remains. Well, for babies, children and teenagers, actually it's very hard to tell what sex the individual was, because a lot of the sex differences in the skeleton only really appear at puberty. But in adults, there are 2 areas of the skeleton that we typically look at most. So the pelvis, the hip bones, and the skull. The pelvis, or the hips, are a functional characteristic, if you like, because they tend to be broader and have a wider birth canal for the baby to pass through in women. So we can see sex differences there. In the skull, they're mainly secondary sex characteristics. So things like males tend to have slightly heavier musculature because of higher levels of testosterone, and that leaves all marks on the bones that we can then pick out, and things like the brow ridges above the eyes tend to be more developed in males as well.
What about the age question?
In terms of age at death, it's almost the other way round there. So actually for babies, children and teenagers, we can get a much more precise and accurate idea of age at death. And that's based on the development of the teeth, so the formation of the teeth and also their eruption, but also on the formation of the skeleton and the bones. Whereas for adults, actually it's much harder to be really precise and accurate about how old someone was when they died. Because once the skeleton and the teeth have all finished forming, we have to rely basically on wear and tear on the skeleton and trying to figure out how old someone was based on this wear and tear. And obviously many factors affect that. I mean, how active you are, whether you have a good diet, how healthy you are, all affect how much wear and tear your skeleton will show. So it becomes really difficult, especially in older adults.
I was very taken with that piece of research that showed that amputation in that 30,000-year-old early human ancestor that was reported a couple of months ago, and the fact that they were able to say this individual would have had that injury aged about 12 and they died about age 16. How would they have known that, for example, that person survived for 4 years after that injury and didn't die from it?
I mean, it was a really remarkable study, and one way you can tell, so basically once your bone has had some kind of injury, so that could be an amputation or say you break your arm or something, the bone goes through a healing process. So we can see that if someone died at about the time that an injury happened or an amputation happened, there won't be much healing. And if they survive for a while afterwards, then there will be evidence of healing and the bone smooths over, that kind of thing. So particularly in that case, because in a younger individual, we can be quite precise about how old they were when they died. And then we know, it must have taken approximately that period of time for that level of healing to occur. We can then work back and say, okay, if they were 16 when they died, they must have been, say, 12 when that injury or that amputation happened in this case.
You reminded me of a question that I just seen come in from Georgia, that something you alluded to, which we'll pick up on a bit later on, but it's quite funny. She said, well, when does grave robbing become archaeology? And that's sort of what you were saying. We'll come to that
really interesting one.
a bit later on. Thanks, Emma. It's The Naked Scientist with me, Chris Smith, and this week we're answering your science questions. Of course, if you would like to get a question into a programme like this, do send it over to chris@thenakedscientist.com. You can also tweet us, it's @nakedscientist, or you can look us up on Facebook. With me this week are archaeologist Emma Pomeroy, physicist Andrew Morris, astronomer Rosemary Williams, and politics and global health specialist Jonathan Kennedy. Still to come in the programme, why do my ears pop on planes, wonders one person, And why indeed is glue sticky? Plus, we're going to probe the workings of black holes. But before that, Jonathan, here's one for you. How do we trace back viral outbreaks to their source? Is it just a case of tracking down patients who've got the symptoms and then find the first one, or is it more involved than that?
Well, I think it's not just viral outbreaks. I think we can look at epidemics and pandemics as one category. And perhaps it helps if we go back to the first epidemiologist, John Snow. So in about the 1830s, Europe was hit by cholera for the first time. And people didn't know what was causing this horrible disease. Some people thought it was due to miasma.
Bad air.
Bad air, literally bad air. Other people thought that it might have been some kind of plot by the rich to poison the poor, because it was poor people living in crowded, insanitary urban slums that were being most affected. And John Snow had a hunch that this was a waterborne disease, which was revolutionary at the time because germ theory hadn't been accepted at all. And this made sense, or it makes sense in hindsight, because, for example, London, where John Snow lived, was a city of about 3 million people in the middle of the 19th century, but it had no kind of integrated sewage and water network. Enormous amounts of human waste just flowed into the Thames, and London inhabitants got their drinking water from that very same river. So when a cholera epidemic broke out in 1854, Snow ran to Soho in the centre of London where the outbreak was occurring, and he undertook what's probably the first epidemiological study. He went around and he interviewed people that were affected, and he tried to work out what linked them together in their working life and in their kind of everyday life. And he realised that it must be related to this water pump on Broad Street, which is still in Soho if you happen to go there.
Amazing insight to think that because we take this for granted these days, don't we, that something must cause something, there must be a connection between all the individuals. We ask all the people what their common exposure is, and that must be the reason that they've got the problem. But for him to do that in that era where we didn't even know that germs existed and that therefore they could be contained in a water supply and transmitted via water, that was really a big leap.
No, it was absolutely revolutionary, and sadly his ideas weren't accepted in his lifetime. So he died about 4 years later, and there was a 33-word obituary in The Lancet, the prestigious medical journal, and it didn't
But did they take him seriously at the time? So when he said, look, there is this water pump, there are all these cases that seem to be connected to it, did people take it seriously at the time, stop using the pump, and the disease went away, thus proving he must have been right?
Yes and no. So the local authorities, they looked at his evidence and agreed to remove the handle of the pump, and then the outbreak stopped. But the broader scientific community, in particular the commissioners that were charged with looking at the causes of the 54 outbreak, rejected his idea, and they kind of doubled down on the miasma theory. And in this obituary to Snow a few years later, there was no mention whatsoever of his work on epidemiology. It was all about his work on anaesthetics, which was the other thing that he was known for. And it wasn't until the next outbreak, which occurred in 1866. So this was after the sewers had been built in London, and the last remaining place in London to not have sewers connected, around Bethnal Green, had the big outbreak, and that finally convinced people that this was the waterborne disease. But to come back to the question, if we look at COVID now and the way that that's traced back to the wet market in Wuhan, it's pretty similar methods. Epidemiologists have worked out that a large number of people that had the disease early on had been at the market, and so that's a very likely point at which it jumped over from animals to human. But still, we're not 100% certain that that's the case. It's just this circumstantial evidence.
It's interesting that there is that historical route to this aspect of epidemiology, but like many amazing leaps in science, it was too early, too soon, and people didn't take it seriously, and it took more convincing. I suppose it's kind of good in some respects that science is robust enough to defend itself against arguments and wants to be convinced, but we mustn't be too dogmatic in our thinking. We must be open to new arguments and new evidence, I suppose, is the moral of that story.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point, although I like to think hopefully science has advanced quite a lot since the kind of 1850s. The state of kind of medical understanding then was pretty rudimentary, and it hadn't changed much since the ancient Greeks, to be honest. So there's been a massive revolution in understanding the last 150
Although,
years.
I mean, you make this point that germ theory, the idea that there were germs that could be transmitted between individuals, had yet to be born at the time that all this was going on. And I was having this same conversation with someone the other day where we were pointing out that, in fact, if you look at the mortality rates and how long people were living and so on in that period in London, they were plummeting well before we even discovered what germs were, or, for instance, deaths from tuberculosis were plummeting well before we even knew what caused it, and it was all about cleaning up London, giving people better living conditions, giving people fresh water, sewage, better food. So public health did all that well before modern medicine came along.
No, exactly. And I think it shows the importance of politics to public health. The fact that there were political reforms in the UK in the 1860s, 1870s that made it politically viable to basically borrow money and spend it on public health, because the electorate had been expanded so much that the people that were benefiting could actually vote for that but didn't have to pay for it.
Sounds nice. And many governments are accused of eventually running out of other people's money to spend, and that's when they get voted out. Thanks for that, Jonathan. Andrew, over to you. Got a question here from Liz, which is an intriguing one. And she says, how do painkillers know where the pain is in my body? I mean, how does the pill know where it hurts?
Yes, a very interesting question. You might imagine that pills must have some kind of destination board on the front saying, I'm headed for the liver, or I'm going to sort out that headache. But it ain't like that, really. The clue to this is in the fantastic discoveries that different molecules have got different shapes, different structures. Actually, where we are in Cambridge is one of the great centres for discovering the structure of molecules. Originally, people used to look at the structure of rocks and minerals through shining X-rays and doing crystallography on them. And then people hit on the idea that we could do this with biological substances. If we could only make them into crystals, we could work out what the structure of these molecules is. And indeed, the famous Nobel laureate Dorothy Hodgkin used X-rays, made crystals of penicillin and later on insulin, and discovered the precise structure. And what that means, of course, just to make it clear, molecules are assemblies of atoms that are all bonded tightly together, and they make an overall shape. And in the body, a huge number of molecules are very large, extremely large. They're called macromolecules. In fact, proteins are one example, DNA is another. And proteins are constructions of hundreds or often thousands of atoms into one gigantic molecule, which wraps up into a kind of globule. They're called globular proteins. And on the surface of these proteins, they have crevices and little hills and valleys. And proteins in the body, distributed often on the surface of different cells, have different shaped crevices and different shaped hills and valleys. Now, when we take a drug like a painkiller or any other drug, a beta blocker or a statin, these are small molecules, much, much smaller. And they've got a particular shape as well. So what happens when you take them? They course through the body, through the fluid systems, through the blood, in particular the bloodstream. And it's only when the shape of this little molecule happens to pass by a crevice or a little niche on a protein, and it fits. It's like a lock and a key. The drug molecule fits the crevice on a protein that it sticks. Basically, the small molecules, the drugs and the medicine are passing by almost everything until it reaches a specific receptor. It's called a receptor because that's where it receives the drug.
A bit like triggering a landslide in your valleys, discreetly in just the right valleys, because the drug is addressed to the right parts of the body that have the right shape valley for that to happen.
I mean, I've emphasised shape there, but I should also, for accuracy, say that there's an electrical issue as well, that molecules tend to have a positive end and a negative end, and they have to match up. So the positive end of a drug molecule matches up with a negative place on the receptor molecule.
There's a well-known slogan for one brand that it hits pain where it hurts. And so in some respects, that's not wrong. It's that the drug does kind of know where the problem is because the problem only exists where it hurts.
Absolutely.
And so it binds to the right place.
Absolutely.
Andrew, thank you very much. Jonathan, over to you. I saw online this claim and I haven't fact-checked it, so take this with a pinch of salt. It says there's an estimated 1 followed by 31 zeros individual viruses on Earth. Now, that's a big number. But as the old saying goes, even fleas have fleas. So are there viruses that prey on viruses?
Yeah, so I think that number is correct. I saw it quoted in Nature Microbiology too, and I found an interesting fact that if you lay all of the viruses on Earth end to end, they would stretch for 100 million light years.
I mean, that's really saying something when we're talking about something which is about a flu virus is 1/10,000th of a millimetre across. So that's a lot of viruses, isn't it?
I think it's so hard to get one's head around both the size of viruses but also the enormous number of viruses in the world. So, for example, it might be easier to conceptualize if you take a litre of seawater, it's 100 billion virus particles in that litre. Or if you take a kilogram of soil from the earth, there's about 1 trillion. So that's 1 million virus particles in just a kilo of soil. It's just absolutely mind-blowing. But I think the thing to remember is that animals and plants and fungi, although they dominate our view of what the tree of life is, they only actually kind of represent a tiny amount of the tree of life. The vast majority of species are bacteria and archaea, so kind of single-celled organisms on the whole. And only a few twigs of the tree of life really are made up of complex life, like animals, fungi, and plants. So I saw some studies where it says that there's less than 10 million species of complex life, but there's about 1 trillion types of bacteria and archaea. So it's really mind-blowing. And you might say, oh, well, these are just tiny little insignificant things. But actually, if you took all the bacteria on the planet and weighed the mass of them, they would weigh 100 times more than all the humans on the planet. So they're still really significant. But to come back to the question, the vast majority of viruses are viruses that infect bacteria, so what we call bacteriophages or phages, from the Greek to devour. And these actually play an enormously important role in the way the whole ecosystem works, because they kill an estimated 20 to 40% of bacteria on the planet every single day. And this allows kind of the world to maintain the ecosystem to maintain its balance. So yeah, super important. But viruses can play positive as well as kind of disease-carrying roles in the world
we
live
talked
in.
the other day in our programme about tuberculosis, about the use of these bacteriophages to kill those TB bugs. But returning to the question, which was, are there viruses that prey on viruses? They have been discovered, haven't they? There are so-called virophages. There are viruses that piggyback on other viruses and infect viruses. So when a virus is growing in a cell, you can get another virus comes in and gets into the process and steals some of the resources the other virus is making for itself, so it can basically parasitize a parasite. Yeah. So viruses are incredible things, aren't they?
Mind-blowing stuff, yeah.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
It's The Naked Scientists with me, Chris Smith. We're answering the science questions you've been sending in this week with Emma Pomeroy, Andrew Morris, Rosemary Williams and Jonathan Kennedy. They are, between them, a space scientist, an archaeologist, a physicist and a global health specialist. Right, it's quiz time, everybody. I knew you were all eagerly anticipating this. We do this whenever we have a Q&A programme. It's our opportunity to test the mettle of our panel, but also you can play along at home. We've got 4 people here in the studio, so logically that breaks down into 2 teams, and I'm going to divide you up into Emma and Andrew as team 1, and Jonathan and Rosemary are going to be team 2. You're actively encouraged to confer between you, please. Now, we've got 3 rounds for this, and the first round is the World Cup. Now, don't worry, this is not actually, I'm told, about football. You're right, because it's a peg. With the biggest sporting competition in the world just about to kick off, we've got 2 questions based around the competing teams. So are our teams, I ask you at home, going to be sick as parrots, or are they going to be over the moon? Well, question 1 for Emma and Andrew. Which of these previous World Cup host nations have been awarded the most Nobel Prizes for science? I'll give you 3 options. And by Nobel Prizes for science, it's physics, chemistry, or the physiology or medicine prize. We're not including peace or literature here. So is it A, Switzerland, B, France, or C, Germany? Which of those World Cup host nations has had the most Nobel Prizes for science in the past? What do you think? Do confer.
France had a lot in the early days with the Curies and everything, didn't it?
Yes. No, it's a difficult one, though, and I was worried it was going to be a question about football, and then actually it's more about Nobel Prizes, but I still don't feel I really know the answer. So
Germany industrialised very early,
right,
and did an awful lot of science.
Going to have to hurry you. Switzerland, France or Germany?
I go for France.
Yeah, let's go for France, I think.
You'll go.
Yeah, I'm happy with
I've got
France.
some fantastic sound effects for this week, okay, which Will, our producer, has imaginatively titled Goal or Miss. And you are going to get a... Unfortunately, it's a miss. No, the answer is Germany. It's got the 3rd highest number of scientific Nobel Prizes, 79 across all categories. And they're behind, do you know who? Us. UK on 90. But of course, the leader's out in front, the USA, big country, 273. You were right to point the finger at France, who have 35 Nobel Prizes in science, but Switzerland so far has only got 18. I'm afraid that's a miss for you guys. Question 2 is going Jonathan and Rosemary's way. And again, another world event happening right now, COP27, very much in the news at the moment. This is the climate conference. They've got a focus at COP27 on preserving biodiversity. So what we want to know, Jonathan and Rosemary, is which of the following nations at this year's World Cup has the highest biodiversity index ranking? And if you want to know what one of those is, a biodiversity index is defined by what percentage of all of the world's animal species are found in that country. So which of these countries has the highest biodiversity index? Is it Mexico, Australia, or the United States? What do you think?
The U.S. is so broad. There's so many different biomes within the U.S. I know Australia is a lot of desert, but
it also has some rainforest. But enormous amount of kind of the outback as well, where there doesn't seem to be much. And maybe the best way to work it out is biodiversity seems to, or there's a rule, right, that it increases as you get closer to the equator. Because there's more sun, there's more vegetation.
Oh,
therefore.
yeah.
So in that
maybe
case,
Mexico
or Australia. I don't know. You decide.
Let's go Mexico.
Going Mexico. And you've scored a goal. Well done.
Oh, we did.
It is indeed Mexico. Brazil.
Well done.
Brazil
Go team.
would be far too easy. That was the highest. Mexico 6th in the world for biodiversity. 10% of the total world species are found there. Australia 7th place, and the US is in position number 10. UK, we're a small island. It's down the bottom of the world rankings. Hopefully our national team will do a bit better in the World Cup. Right, over to round 2, back to Emma and Andrew. So this round is which came first. And so we're asking you, which invention of these three came first? Is it the raincoat, the hot air balloon, or the photograph? The raincoat, the hot air balloon, or the photograph? Which of those inventions came first?
Wow. I think the one I have really no idea about is the raincoat.
Well, I was thinking Macintosh.
That's a kind of computer, though, isn't it? That's very modern.
But then actually, I mean, how are we defining raincoat? And that sounds a very boring scientist's answer. But if you were talking about using skins or some kind of fabric that was impregnated with something that would help make it waterproof, that could actually go back quite a long way in terms of archaeology, using fats or something like that on skins or tanned hides. So I
go for Macintosh, definitely. Yeah. I'd see the hot air balloon a bit later.
Yeah, and photography seems...
So you're going raincoat is the earliest. Raincoat is the earliest. Unfortunately, you've hit the bar again. It's the hot air balloon was the answer. Would you have got that? You too? Were you saying, Rosemary? You looking proud of yourself?
That was my guess. That I have no idea who did it, but I know Da Vinci made a lot of really cool, weird machines. So I was like, maybe the hot air balloon.
Well, the raincoat. You were quite right, Andrew. The raincoat was invented by a Scottish architect, Charles Mackintosh. That was in 1823. The first photograph was 1814, which was the French inventor Joseph Nicephore Niepce. But in 1783, following tests with a rooster, a duck and a sheep first, followed by a human pilot who was the French Pilatre de Rosier, was his name, he successfully ascended to the dizzy height of 25 metres in a hot air balloon that was built by the Montgolfier brothers. So there is your answer, Rosemary. So unfortunately, you didn't score on that one. So at the moment, Team 2 are in the lead. They have 1 point. Let's find out if they can cement their lead, Rosemary and Jonathan. We want to know which of these was discovered first. A, the planet Uranus, B, the element hydrogen, or C, the cell. What was discovered first?
Okay, so William Herschel discovered Uranus in, oh gosh, I should know this. I want to say like the 1800s. I don't know about the cell or hydrogen.
The cell, I'm not sure about the cell. The first person to use a microscope to look at what he called animalcules was Antony von Leeuwenhoek. I think I might have pronounced it wrong. A Dutch haberdasher who ground lenses because he wanted to look at the quality of his curtains that he was buying and selling, and then he started to look at water and saw these kind of very tiny things. But I'm not sure if he would have identified the cell. But that was back in the late 16 1600s.
So it's got to be before Uranus then.
Perhaps, but maybe he didn't label them as cells. And hydrogen, I have no idea.
Hydrogen.
Gonna have to hurry you.
Oh man. Maybe the cell.
Okay, let's go with
Let's
that.
go with the cell.
Are you going cells?
Yeah. Oh.
And you scored another goal. Very good.
Oh.
Well done.
Wow.
You're so surprised. You take these penalties and then you expect them to miss and you get one right in the top of the net.
We don't need the third one. It's two.
You're quite right to choose the cell. I'll give you the reasoning and the argument behind this. All of them were discovered a long time ago, but Uranus, you're quite right, was Sir William Herschel, 1781. So a little bit earlier than you speculated. Hydrogen, Henry Cavendish, Cambridge man, 1766. But the earliest of all was the cell. You were right with your dating. Robert Hooke described the cell in 1665, and his collaborator was Leeuwenhoek, who was sending to the Royal Society reams and reams of drawings of things he had seen with his tiny little glass droplet lenses. So very, very good. Do you want to have a go at the last one? Because it is quite funny. See if you can redeem yourselves and get off the ground, team one. Because it will be about time if you do so, and that is the name of the next round. Round 3, it's about time. Emma and Andrew, our planet's rotational speed is gradually slowing. This is because of friction effects associated with the tides, which are giving energy to the moon, speeding it up. So that means the length of a day on Earth was shorter in the past. How long was a day about 1.5 billion years ago? Was it A, 12 hours, B, 18 hours, or C, 23 hours long?
I have even less idea than I had about the last two, and we didn't do
possibly
particularly well at
calculate
those.
No, I go along with the frictional effect and the slowing down. Yeah, I go with that because of the tides.
So what do you reckon the day length was?
So should we go over the 23 billion?
That would be my instinct.
23 hours?
Yeah.
You're going 23. I'm really sorry that you haven't redeemed yourself. You scored 3 misses. I don't know who you're taking penalties for, but you're not going to be on their team for the World Cup.
Never very good at football.
The answer is B. It was actually 18 hours long. The formation of the Earth, the day was as short as 12 hours, but on average, because the length of a year increases by a second every 65,000 years or so, if you wind the clock back, it was about 18 hours back then. Do you want to have a go, you two, and see what you would have won? The average human lifespan across the planet is about 73, but there are members of the animal kingdom that achieve this many times over, and one of the oldest living vertebrates, in other words, an animal with a spine, is believed to be the Greenland shark. One individual got carbon dated. In fact, they looked at its eyeball for various reasons, and they found that it was the longest living vertebrate that had ever been discovered. How old did the scientists think that she was? Was it A, 191.5 years, B, 301 years, or C, 401 years?
I feel like I remember reading something about a shark being like older than the United States. I could be pulling that out of nowhere, but I feel like I read that. So
I think it's really, really old. I mean, they're funny species, aren't they? I believe they get these parasitic worms in their eyes that they obviously can't get rid of because they don't have fingers or hands to take them out, and they kind of go around for hundreds of years with these parasitic worms in their eyes. But I'd probably go for the longest, the oldest.
The oldest?
You going the oldest?
Do you?
That's 401 years.
That's
Answer
so
C.
old. I'm going to stick to 301.
You're going to go 301.
with you.
Well, yeah, okay.
You've missed your first shot on goal. It's actually 401 years. It was
Wow.
the way they proved it was with radiocarbon dating. The eyeballs, because they contain tissues that are not replaced during the lifetime of the animal, those are the crystalline proteins that form the lens. They are not replaced as the animal ages, and so you can look at the age of the carbon atoms in there and how many of them are radioactive and work out how old the animal is. And when this was done, 401 years is the average, because it could be between 272 or perhaps even as old as 512 years. Isn't that amazing? Isn't nature an incredible thing? Anyway, the winners of the Naked Scientists Big Brain of the Week award this week are our astronomer Rosemary Williams and our expert in global health Jonathan Kennedy. I think they deserve a round of applause, don't they, very much? And Team 1, better luck next time. Let's get back to the Q&A. Andrew, one for you. George wonders, why do my ears go pop when I go through a tunnel in a train or on an aeroplane when I'm going up and down in the air?
I've got a friend who's in my discussion group who asked a similar question once, and she loves going to the Canary Islands. And she had a cold and her whole head was blocked. And when the plane took off, she found that her ears got unblocked again. And it was wonderful. So she had lovely hearing on the flight. And then when it descended, her ears all blocked up again. What it seems is that there's obviously a difference in air pressure in a cabin in an aeroplane. The air pressure is raised by taking air from the engines, bleeding it off into the cabin. But the air pressure in the cabin of an airplane is still slightly less than it is at ground level. In fact, it's about the same pressure as the top of a mountain. And that's to make sure that the stresses on the fuselage don't lead to the plane exploding. So you've got a slightly lower pressure than normal. But of course, the other side of your eardrum, inside your middle ear, is still got the air pressure that you've got when you took off. So there's an imbalance between the air pressure on one side of your eardrum and the other side of the eardrum. And of course, this happens when you walk up a mountain, or as we say, you get similar effects going into a tunnel on a train. But your ear's got a brilliant mechanism for balancing out, equalising the pressure on both sides. And it's called the eustachian tube. The eustachian tube vents, as it were, it vents the middle ear out back to the normal atmospheric external pressure through your nose. So when you yawn or the experience of walking up a mountain and feeling the pressure change, or in an aeroplane, what's happening is the middle ear is venting itself through the eustachian tube, a little burst of air, to make sure that the pressure on both sides of the eardrum is the same.
And if you get a cold and it clogs up, that's why it can take a bit longer for that to happen. Yeah. Thanks very much for that. This is The Naked Scientists. I'm Chris Smith. With me this week, Rosemary Williams, Emma Pomeroy, Jonathan Kennedy and Andrew Morris. And together we're answering the science questions that you've been sending us. Rosemary, over to you. This one's from Rich, and he's wondering about black holes. And he's heard that black holes are rotating. So what's rotating about them?
So in order to understand why black holes rotate, we have to understand how they form. So black holes, essentially, they form when you have a star that collapses under its own weight. There's two main processes happening inside a star. You have gravity that's pulled all of this hydrogen and helium together, and then you have a nuclear fusion at the core that's essentially, forcing all of these hydrogen atoms together to form helium, and then 3 heliums together to form a carbon, and that's providing a lot of energy that's stopping the collapse. But eventually, stars are going to run out of this fuel at the center, and you no longer have a big force outward due to nuclear fusion. So you just have gravity forcing itself inward, and that star starts to collapse on itself. Now, all of the stars that we have observed have had some sort of spin. They've all rotated. And in physics, just like there's conservation of energy, you have this thing called conservation of angular momentum. You have to keep the same momentum over time, over everything. You have to maintain it. So when the black hole is collapsing, it's going to keep that momentum of the star that existed before it, right? So you have a star that's spinning, much like you have ice skater that's spinning. They bring their arms in, they spin faster. That's the same thing that's happening. You have a star that's spinning, it collapses in on itself, it still has to spin. And the question of what exactly is spinning, well, you have a singularity at the center of a black hole. And we usually say, kind of hand wavy, it's this infinite density thing. You have a lot of mass in this infinitesimally small space. But in reality, it does have some volume. It's just so small that we can just kind of say that it doesn't. And so it is that tiny, tiny volume of mass at the center of a black hole that's spinning. Now, we don't exactly know what is happening at the center of a black hole, and we may never know, so it's important to say that. But that's, what we've theorized to have happened based off of equations and physics and all of that. But physics gets super wonky on these small scales.
Thank you. Brilliantly explained. Yeah. Andrew, one for you. And this comes from someone called Andrew who wants to know, what is it about glue that means it is sticky? So how does glue stick stuff?
I mean, glues are sticky only really when they're connecting two surfaces. It's not a kind of magic property that they have. and they only stick when the right surfaces and the right glues meet each other.
Hence the old joke, how do they get the glue to come out the tube then? If it's so sticky, why doesn't it stick to the tube?
Exactly. We all know, probably got examples from our woodwork classes of glues that never worked and so on. And it's back to this story about the forces between molecules, adhesive forces and cohesive forces. Because if you look at two surfaces in contact through a high-powered microscope, it is extraordinary to see that they're really, really rough. It's like this kind of top of a mountain range on one surface meeting the top of a mountain range on another surface and grating against each other. So actually, when two surfaces are in contact, it's mostly empty space in between them and just the peaks, one peak meeting another peak where they're actually physically in contact. So the job of glue is to get in there into the space between two surfaces, and it might penetrate through cracks, or it might just get absorbed into the surrounding material, or there might even be a chemical bond. But once the glue penetrates one way or another into the two surfaces that would be bonded, the question is, do the forces that hold the glue molecules together, that's called cohesion, are they less or greater than the forces of attraction between the glue molecules and the surface, which is called the adhesion? So glues have to adhere from the glue surface to the surface they're connecting, but they also have to cohere so that the glue doesn't fall apart itself.
Can you help me out then and tell me why I can't get Weetabix off of a bowl that's gone dry?
Oh, there's a new one.
I mean, it's a similar thing to wallpaper paste, I presume, isn't it? Because it's starch.
Yeah.
And I presume because that's a stringy molecule, it's doing exactly as you say and threading the tendrils of starch into the rough surface of the ceramic in the same way as the wallpaper paste gets into the back of the wallpaper and the wall.
Very good, and very good point. And at the fundamental physics level, it's electrical attraction. I mean, to make it simple, it's the fact that one molecule electrically is attracted to another molecule.
I have a lot of electrical attraction. I'm sure you can sympathise with that. Rosemary, one for you from Peter, who's asking about the Big Bang and says, if everything started in the Big Bang, how can we still see it? I think he's referring here to, for instance, what we dub the afterglow of the Big Bang or the cosmic microwave background radiation. He says, wouldn't the light from that event be well past us now, unless we travelled faster than the speed of light in some way? So how can we still see it?
Yeah, to think of this question, you have this big explosion and going away from the explosion, you have a lot of light, you have a lot of energy that's turning into mass, right? E equals mc squared. You can turn that energy into a mass. We actually did go faster than the speed of light. But it's a tricky question. There's a lot of caveats to that. It is as if imagine you have like a stretchy sheet. Objects on this sheet, which represent space-time, let's see, marbles, are constrained to move below or at the speed of light, 300,000 kilometers per second. But the sheet itself can stretch faster than the speed of light. It's not constrained to this 300,000 kilometers per second. So although particles and things within this sheet have a speed limit, the sheet doesn't. So you can kind of get around this. It's kind of like you can walk on a train, right? You have your speed on a train. Maybe you're walking, 4 kilometers per hour or something, but the train itself could be moving 90 kilometers per hour. And so because of that, we're still getting light from the Big Bang because we've kind of outrun it and now it's catching up to us. So now we're able to see this light, this energy, temperature, the cosmic microwave background from all around us coming from the Big Bang, which is super, super cool.
In summary, then, you're saying the universe is born, there's all these particles together sharing the same energy at that moment in time, which is what's going to ultimately give them the cosmic microwave background radiation as it is today. That bit of the universe, the sheet they're all sitting in, gets much bigger very, very promptly and much bigger than the speed of light and drags the particles with it effectively. They haven't moved, but because the space between them has got much bigger, much more quickly. When we appear, we're seeing those things all over the place in the observable universe, so we're seeing as though that light is coming to us for the first time. Yeah,
and I think the really interesting thing about this is if you could see through kind of this fog, we call it recombination around us, you would be able to see the Big Bang happening all around you if you had a super powerful telescope. Because when you're looking through space, you're looking back in time. And so in theory, if you looked in any one direction far enough, you'd see the Big Bang. And if you turned around and looked really far in that direction, you'd see the Big Bang. So the Big Bang would be happening all around you, which is so incredibly weird.
It is a bit mind-boggling, isn't it? But the way you've put it, very, very clear. Thank you for that. Jonathan, this one, which we mentioned earlier in the programme, when we get ill, our body temperature goes up. And in fact, researchers have done scientific studies from thousands of temperature measurements made in Germany and other parts of the world 100 years ago and compared it today. We're apparently 1 degree warmer in the past than we are today. But why does our temperature go up, this person says, when we get ill?
I think the answer to this is just quite simple, right? It's just the body's immune response to being infected. And many viruses, many bacteria that infect humans are very temperature sensitive. And so the body's immune system increases its temperature in order to make it less hospitable for these pathogens.
You're basically cooking them into submission. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or at least kind of discouraging them from reproducing and making us even more sick.
And Emma, one for you. Martin is wondering about the paleo diet. He doesn't say whether he's trying it or anything, but he says, is there any scientific or evolutionary backing to things like the paleo diet? What does that actually mean, that term?
So the idea of the paleo diet is that the optimal diet for humans to eat, and the one that we probably ate for most of our evolutionary history as a species, which is something like, 300,000 years, is what hunter-gatherers would eat. So you would think of wild hunted game, so they have low body fat compared to domesticated species, for example, so very lean meat, not eating things like pulses and grasses, things like that, going for wild foods, not the kind of domesticated things that are the foundation of our diet today.
But it still would critically contain meat.
Yes. And I guess there's different versions of the diet depending on who you ask. The big problem here, there's various big problems here. So one is that there is not a single diet that even contemporary hunter-gatherers eat, let alone hunter-gatherers in the past. There's been climate changes. We find hunter-gatherers everywhere from the tropics right up into the Arctic. And of course, they're eating very different diets. So there is no one diet that humans are adapted for. It's also the case that we're adapted to eat some of the foods that we have domesticated since the adoption of agriculture. We can see evidence for adaptation to consume milk, for example, and also changes in our carbohydrate metabolism that are linked to that. And equally, we know, if we look in the archaeological record, we can see evidence of even Neanderthals gathering grasses and wild grains and eating those. So it's not so simple as there's one diet that humans are adapted for, or that certain types of food are necessarily good or bad. And really, we have to take a much more pragmatic and holistic approach to our diet and think about other factors as well, like exercise. The amount of energy we're using, that will affect how much food and what kinds of resources our body needs. So we can't really single out diet on its own to really know what's going to be healthy and best for our bodies.
Rosemary, Roger says, now we can see back almost to the beginning of the universe. We can see a long way in each direction. So what shape is the universe that we see?
Oh, this is a tricky question. So this is kind of addressing a part in astronomy that is the observable universe versus the universe itself. So the observable universe being when you look up at the night sky, when telescopes are looking at the night sky, what they can see, the amount of light that they're getting in from all different directions. And we know that that is a sphere because when we look up around us, we can see stuff in all directions. Now, the universe as a whole, there's 3 different possibilities for what it could be. It could either be a sphere, it could be kind of a saddle shape, or it could be flat. The sphere being a positive curvature in every direction, a saddle shape being this negative curvature, and then flat obviously being no curvature. And I believe this is taken from measurements from the cosmic microwave background, which is so rich in information. That's why studying cosmic microwave background is so important in astronomy, because it gives us so much information about the universe and how we started and the composition of our universe, how much dark matter there is, how much matter there is. And it is one measurement where I believe if it is 1, it is that the universe is flat. If it's above 1, it's curved. And if it's below 1, it means that our universe is kind of negatively curved, this saddle shape. And the current measurements are around this one value, and we haven't gotten it exactly precisely, which is exactly why it's important for us to keep studying cosmic microwave background. But it's hovering around 1, which means that it makes me very uncomfortable to say, but that the universe is kind of flat, which I don't like at all. I want it to be like a sphere. But that's kind of what the science is saying right now. But continuing to study this is very important, and it'll give us a greater understanding of the universe beyond our observable universe.
You obviously like the idea that you can start and go on forever, come back where you started eventually.
Yes,
so,
I do.
Very comforting for you. Jonathan, one for you. This person's asking, a recent paper came out suggesting a person's risk from COVID could be down to Neanderthal genes that they carry. Tell us more.
Well, I think Emma should be able to help us with this as well, so maybe you can chip in. But I think to begin with, we have to remember that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals perhaps had a common ancestor between 500,000 and 750,000 years ago. And so a long time ago, Neanderthal ancestors managed to leave Africa and end up in much of Western Eurasia. And I think evidence has been found everywhere from Gibraltar all the way to the Altai Mountains, right?
Absolutely.
In Siberia. And so from a kind of epidemiological perspective, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were growing up were evolving in very, very different conditions. So you had Neanderthals evolving to adapt to the challenges posed by a temperate climate, and you had Homo sapiens evolving to adapt to the challenges in a tropical area.
Sub-Saharan Africa, so quite a different environment.
And as came up in the quiz, because biodiversity is much higher in the tropics, you don't just have more vegetation, you have more animals, then you have more parasites that live on those animals. So the disease burden carried by Homo sapiens was different.
So they're evolving in different environments, so they're therefore facing and responding to different challenges, which is going to select for different sorts of genetic endowments, as it were, to resistance to different diseases. So how does that then address the question of Neanderthal genes change our risk of COVID?
So let's do another step as well, because I think it's really fascinating. It builds on what we talked on before. But 15 years ago, we didn't know whether Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had actually met. But after the genome of Neanderthals was kind of restructured, we realized that humans have about 2% of Neanderthal DNA. And this isn't just random DNA. This is gene variants that help Homo sapiens adapt to the environment that they face when they're migrating out of Africa 40,000 years ago. So quite a few of these gene variants to do with the immune system. And maybe Emma wants to take over now.
And so actually, you're absolutely right. There's these different variants that are associated with different aspects and different functions of our immune system. And it has been shown by one paper that there's a certain variant that we can track back to Neanderthals that increases susceptibility to COVID. On the other hand, we've got another variant that actually offers some protection as well. So it's a balance, and it's not a clear Neanderthal genes are bad or good, so to speak, in terms of COVID susceptibility.
It's still extraordinary to think that running around in about 2% of our genomes are genes that would have been carried by this other group of our ancestors dating back more than 50,000 years. While you're here, Emma, can you help Georgia, who came forward with this question earlier, which was, when does grave robbing become archaeology? Well, you've got about a minute to answer this. Can you help Georgia with when do we cease to be a grave robber and become an archaeologist?
It's extremely interesting, and I think it's not necessarily about time, because you can actually do archaeology on very recent sites. And people do that. It's more about the motivations and how you do it. So grave robbing is usually acquisitive. So it's to get remains or to get the grave goods to keep or to sell. Whereas archaeology is actually about finding information about the past and in some senses preserving the past. So taking meticulous records and doing everything in meticulous detail to really preserve the knowledge about how people lived in the past.
So it's the intent that matters, isn't it? Thanks, Emma, for that. Well, that is where we must leave it for this week. But thank you very much for listening and for sending in your questions. And thanks, of course, to the wonderful panel who joined us this week: Rosemary Williams, Emma Pomeroy, Jonathan Kennedy and Andrew Morris. Next time, we'll be picking apart the practice of personality testing. Increasingly, the suitability of a given person for a particular role might at least be partly evaluated by their response to questions with seemingly no wrong answer. But is this a fair or a sensible way to give someone a job? We'd also be very interested to hear your perspective on this. Perhaps you've been profiled for a position, successfully or otherwise, and you have an opinion, do let us know. It's chris@thenakedscientist.com if you'd like to share your thoughts on that. And in the meantime, if you would like to support The Naked Scientist, your donations are extremely welcome to help keep the show on the road. We've made it very easy to do that. It's nakedscientist.com/donate. The Naked Scientist comes to you from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Continuing Education. It's supported by Rolls-Royce. I'm Chris Smith, and until next time, goodbye.